Good afternoon, and welcome to Fresh Perspectives on the Future of Federalism. My name is Neil Siegel, and I teach constitutional law at Duke University. You may be interested to know that this session has been approved for CLE credit. Please hold your applause. All those interested in obtaining credit should right now sign in at the CLE table outside the room. Sadly, attendees who do not sign in will not receive credit. And if you're interested in receiving credit, also please submit a completed evaluation form and pick up a certificate of attendance at the CLE table at the end of the panel discussion. I've also been instructed to remind you to silence your cell phones because the session is being taped. So I'm excited to have with me on this panel Jessica Buhlman-Polzin of Columbia Law School, Deep Gulasekaram of Santa Clara University School of Law, Steve Sanders of Indiana University Moore School of Law, and Fernita Tolson of Florida State University College of Law. Many of our national and subnational debates have federalism components, both as a matter of constitutional politics and constitutional law. There are many examples: voter registration, marriage equality, immigration legislation, marijuana regulation, executive power, and healthcare reform. And one may engage the federalism dimensions of these debates from different points of view, from the internal perspective of the faithful participant in the constitutional system who makes claims on the Constitution, or from the external perspective of the analyst of the constitutional system, who wants to understand how the system functions but is not normatively invested in its producing one outcome or another. And regardless of which perspective one occupies, one can approach questions of federalism in methodologically diverse ways. Over the course of the next 90 minutes, our panelists, members of a new generation of federalism scholars, will assess the future of federalism, occupying different interpretive perspectives, focusing on different issue areas, and using different methodological techniques. Our panelists are diverse along all of these dimensions, but they share the distinction of being part of the next generation of progressive legal scholars, a generation that ACS is eager to promote. And I'm pleased to see that other members of this generation are in the audience today, and thank you all for being here. We're going to begin by hearing from Fernita, who will interrogate the question of federal versus state regulatory control in the area of voting rights. We'll turn next to Steve, who will discuss marriage equality from the perspectives of horizontal federalism and substantive due process. Next will be Deep, who will share his empirical research on the politicization of immigration legislation, or the lack of immigration legislation at the state and federal levels, respectively. And then finally, our closer will be Jessica, and she will explain why our federalism today is, to a significant extent, partisan federalism, and why partisan federalism is nonetheless real federalism. Each of our panelists will speak for about five minutes, after which we'll talk among ourselves for a while, and then I'll open up the proceedings and invite questions from all of you. So without further ado, Fernita.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's so wonderful to see so many people who love federalism, just like we do. Awesome. So this panel is about fresh perspectives in federalism. And in the area of voting rights, I don't know how fresh this perspective is, because I think, unfortunately, much of the future of federalism and voting rights actually lies in the past. I think we're going to see more of the state sovereignty rationale circumscribing the scope of congressional authority in this area. Chief Justice Robert said as much in his opinion for the court in the 2009 decision in Northwest Austin. I actually call it Northwest Austin Mud No. 1, but I think it's like Northwest Austin Municipal District versus Holder. But I like the mud part. In that decision, he upheld Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, but he noted that that there were potential constitutional problems with the provision, in part because the preclearance provision only applied to certain jurisdictions. And so, in essence, it treated similarly situated sovereigns differently in a way that's offensive to our system of federalism. But what the opinion does is ignore that state sovereignty really is contextual. So what I mean by this is that when you look at federal elections, Congress really is sovereign over federal elections. The Elections Clause gives states the ability to choose the time, place, and manner of federal elections, but subject to Congress's authority to make or alter state provisions. So you can comfortably say that Congress retains the last word in that area. Congress can also regulate pursuant to its authority under the 14th and 15th Amendments and circumscribe the scope of state authority over state elections, particularly where racial discrimination is present. At best, I think it's wise to say that states retain only limited sovereignty in this area, i.e. sovereignty over their own state electoral practices where there's no abridgment of the right to vote and no racial discrimination present. Now, that's not to say that this limited sovereignty is not important or vital to our system of federalism. But what the court does is underestimate the scope of congressional authority in this area. The broad scope of congressional authority is likely to carry little weight in the voting rights cases currently pending before the Supreme Court. So in Shelby County, and note this caveat, I'm not reading the tea leaves here. This is what I suspect. I feel comfortable saying this because others have said it over the last couple days. And I agree with it. I think what the court will do is probably strike down the coverage formula of Section 4B while upholding Section 5. So this will be, in my opinion, a compromise decision because the court is conceding that Congress has enough authority to enact the preclearance provisions, but at the same time, the court is saying, look, you haven't updated the formula in over 40 years. And so if you're going to single out these sovereign states, you have to justify your decision to do so. Another case pending before the Supreme Court right now that doesn't get that much attention, but it's still very important, is the Arizona Intertribal case. That case involves a conflict between the National Voter Registration Act, or the Motor Voter Law, and Arizona's requirement that individuals show proof of U.S. citizenship in order to register to vote. So the Motor Voter Law does not require such proof. Now, that case may be a little bit more difficult to predict, in part because the court's preemption jurisprudence is very different from its federalism jurisprudence. The court seems like it's more willing to infringe on the court's ability to govern or state autonomy. This is evident from its preemption cases. Although the court takes a very strong stance in cases where it feels like state sovereignty or the identity of states as states is being infringed by the federal government. So you can conceivably predict an outcome where the court finds that the Motor Voter Law preempts Arizona's Proposition 200, while at the same time striking down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act because they see them as raising two different and distinct federalism issues. And so it'll be really interesting to see what the court does in the next couple of weeks. But I do predict that we could potentially have two decisions that look like they may be in tension with each other, but depending on if you distinguish the state's ability to govern versus the state's identity as states, I think that you can have these two decisions that look different but make sense in the court's jurisprudence. And I'll stop there, Neil.
Great. Thank you very much. Steve.
Thanks, Neil. When we think about federalism, it's usually the relationship between the states and the federal government that we think of. Who should control voting? Who should have the last word on immigration policy? Should the federal government prosecute dispensers of medical marijuana, despite the fact that states are the level where medical practice is regulated? Should the federal government have its own family law in the form of the Defense of Marriage Act, even though every other aspect of matrimonial law is done at the state level? Well, by contrast to this, I'd like us to think for a few minutes about something that gets less attention from legal scholars, and that's horizontal federalism. In other words, the relationship of the states to one another as co-equal sovereigns. I think about this issue in the context of marriage equality because I think there are really two same-sex marriage problems in our country for the Constitution, for constitutional law to grapple with. First is the right of same-sex couples to get married. That's the issue we're most familiar with and that we typically think about. But second is the right of same-sex couples to remain married, a topic that I think has not received nearly enough attention either in the news media or in litigation or in scholarship. Imagine that Helen and Jenny reside and marry in Iowa. Iowa is among the 12 states plus the District of Columbia where same-sex marriage is now legal. Now imagine that Helen and Jenny pull up stakes and move permanently to Indiana. Maybe it's a family matter or an educational pursuit or a job transfer. Demographic data tell us, by the way, that several thousand legally married same-sex couples will change states like this every year. Now consider that of the 36 states like Indiana, where I teach, that still have laws banning same-sex marriage, most of these laws are understood not only to prevent the creation of marriages, they also purport to deny legal recognition, in fact, in some cases even to void, same-sex marriages that were perfectly legal in the states where they were originally celebrated. In other words, Indiana claims the power to effectively divorce Helen and Jenny against their will by operation of law, to treat Helen and Jenny's Iowa marriage license essentially like a piece of worthless foreign currency. And moreover, Section 2 of the Defense of Marriage Act, what's typically known as its choice of law provision, which is not currently before any federal court and will not be affected by the Supreme Court's decision this month, purports to give the states the green light to do just this under the full faith and credit clause. And if you look at the story in today's New York Times, that story very perceptively points out the fact that even if Section 3, the federal recognition part of DOMA, falls, the federal rights of married same-sex couples may still vary and depend on what state they live in, whether that state considers them to be legally married or not. Surprisingly, there's no constitutional constraint on this behavior by states under prevailing interpretations, conventional wisdom, of the structural and federalism provisions of our Constitution, like the Full Faith and Credit Clause, the Privileges and Immunities Clause, or the Dormant Commerce Clause. And so my fresh perspective, my contribution here is a piece that I published recently in the Michigan Law Review, in which I argue that couples like Helen and Jenny have a liberty interest in the ongoing existence of their marriages that's protected by the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. I argue that they have a right of marriage recognition that's conceptually and doctrinally distinguishable from whatever constitutional right to marry same-sex couples may have. In other words, I think this is a question of individual liberty. It's also a serious question of federalism. We like to think of the states as laboratories of democracy, in Justice Brandeis's memorable phrase, and that could mean that we should allow the issue of creating same-sex marriages to percolate for a while longer, as Justice Sotomayor suggested in the oral arguments in Perry, before the Constitution gets involved. But we should not wait, I think, to answer the question of whether couples like Helen and Jenny, who've already married in states that embrace same-sex marriage, whether they can simply be divorced against their will by operation of law with no due process whatsoever, simply because they've moved into a state that remains hostile to their marriage. Of course, Iowa should not be able to impose its views about marriage on Indiana, but neither should Indiana be allowed to engage in what is essentially predatory behavior that effectively destroys the marriages that Iowa and other equal marriage states have created. And so assuming that the Supreme Court in the Perry case does not settle the question of same-sex marriage for the rest of the country, as I think most of us think it won't, this is the issue that I would like to see be part of the next wave of litigation, to be on the agenda for marriage equality litigators in the federal courts. I think it's actually an even more sympathetic case to make than creating marriages, and it stands on firmer ground given the historic recognition by states of each other's marriages. Interstate transportability is a basic incident of marriage in the United States, something virtually everyone other than gays and lesbians takes for granted. And so if Indiana retains the sovereign right to decide what marriages it wants to license, I argue that a workable federalism also means Indiana cannot undermine Iowa's public policy by refusing to recognize marriages that Iowa has created. Otherwise, we have, in the apt term of former Congressman Bob Barr, the Georgia congressman who was first a proponent and then later a harsh critic of the Defense of Marriage Act, merely a one-way federalism, because the law only protects those states that don't want to accept same-sex marriages granted by other states. Indiana gets to ban creation of same-sex marriages, and it gets to stamp out same-sex marriages created by other states. That's not a sensible understanding of federalism. It's not what it can mean to exist in a federation, in a union of co-equal sovereigns. Finally, I don't think it's a sustainable state of affairs under any legal regime that purports to value the two primary goods that federalism is said to protect: policy innovation, the ability of states to innovate in policies and vindicate those policies fully, and the protection of individual liberty against concentrations of coercive government power in the hands of one particular sovereign. So thank you, and happy to talk more about this subject during the discussion.
Thank you, Steve. Dee.
All right. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to ACS for the invitation, and my co-panelists, and to Neil for moderating. So my comments will be mainly based on a draft paper that will be coming out later in NYU Law Review, which is written with a co-author. That's significant because the co-author is a empiricist in political science. We'll be talking about some of the data that we collected and an analyzation of that data in a study. I also note that in case you have objections to the data or the analysis, you can blame my co-author, who is not here. So I come at this through thinking about immigration questions. Immigration is obviously very hot right now. People talking about possibilities of federal immigration reform. That's obviously only in the last 4 to 6 months, but if you were thinking a little before that, for the past 7 or 8 years, the focus in immigration law has actually not been at the federal level. It's been what's happened at the state and local level. Some of that fervor perhaps dampened, but certainly not stopped by the United States versus Arizona opinion from last year. So during that time, and arguably still, it's a very hot topic of states and localities getting involved in immigration regulation, what we in the field might call immigration federalism. In thinking about immigration federalism, most people, commentators, officials, even courts, have accepted what we call a conventional, or what we might think of as a conventional explanation for state and local action with regards to immigration. This conventional explanation is articulated by both the majority and the dissent in the United States versus Arizona case. It's undergirded by the fundamental notion that what's happening at the federal level with regards to immigration is unrelated and independent from what's happening at the sub-federal level. The basic idea here would be that the federal government, at least since 1996, has been inactive or impotent on the issue of immigration, and since that time, there's been significant unlawful or unauthorized migration. The effects of that unauthorized migration have been acutely felt at the sub-federal level, and especially in particular jurisdictions. And the demographic change, the significant demographic change, the argument would go, at those particular sub-federal jurisdictions has created accompanying public policy problems and challenges, mostly related to things like economic depression, overcrowding, language isolation, etc. And in this story, without significant federal intervention, states and localities have been forced to act. And you can see this narrative being spun, for example, by Governor Jan Brewer, or even former Governor Napolitano when she was the governor of Arizona, or the mayors and cities of several states that have passed immigrant-related ordinances. This story, I think, fits very neatly into a traditional federalism narrative. It accesses many of the traditional tropes of federalism, right? So ideas of regional variance, policy experimentation, et cetera, that have been mentioned. And so what we wanted to do with our project was to really evaluate and ask whether these claims, these factual claims, these demographic claims being made by places like Arizona, Hazleton, Farmers Branch, Texas, et cetera, were in fact supportable. And so we did a quantitative study, a nationwide study, and our data suggested that, in fact, that none of these factors commonly presented or assumed to produce sub-federal legislation was in fact salient in predicting the presence of subfederal immigration regulation. That is to say, there was nothing especially distinct about the demographic change or the public policy problems affecting many of the jurisdictions that passed these types of laws. What was interesting was a finding that the only really salient factor that came up in our data analysis was partisanship. That is to say, political partisanship consistently predicted and was salient in predicting the proposal and passage of immigration laws at the state and local level. Based on this finding, this quantitative finding, we attempted a qualitative empirical study asking through interview questions, media content analysis, how and why exactly political partisanship would be a factor in subfederal immigration regulation, regardless of demographic or underlying demographic concerns. What we discovered in this qualitative analysis was a really interesting, or we might call a politicized explanation for the proliferation of subfederal immigration regulation that we present as an alternative to a conventional explanation that I just presented to you. In this politicized version, we argue that there are an interested group of extra-constitutional actors, those people we might think of as entrepreneurs or issue entrepreneurs or political entrepreneurs, whatever you want to, however you want to term them. But in any case, a group of interested actors who shop prefabricated legislation to jurisdictions where there are ripe political conditions for enacting that type of legislation. At the same time, working to stall federal legislation at key moments so as to provide the appropriate background conditions in order to continue proliferating legislation at the subfederal level. By the way, none of this is meant as a commentary or a judgment on that sort of political activity, simply a description of the networked activity that causes the subfederal proliferation. The other part of the project is to figure out why does this matter, and does it have any implications for how commentators, courts, et cetera, should understand this immigration federalism? How does it affect our understanding of immigration federalism into the future? Does it have any effects on comprehensive immigration reform proposals into 2013? So those are some of the questions we might get to later. Very briefly, though, some of the things to think about here are that when you have when you have this politicized explanation, you have significant subfederal activity that's highly dependent on these partisan opportunities and political entrepreneurship. One of the things that becomes interesting is, and this is borrowing from Larry Kramer's work on the politics of the political safeguards of federalism, you have a significant gravitational pull or effect on national lawmakers by what happens in their subfederal jurisdiction. So, for example, I think even in 2013, when you see any type of immigration legislation get to the House, you'll see that I think certain House members are unable to, because of primary challengers that they will likely face within their own jurisdictions, be able to take compromise positions on immigration reform because of the challenges that they face within their own primary elections. And so there's a significant connection, we argue, a dynamic connection between the subfederal activity and the ability to get federal legislation in this area. And we think this is different than a conventional explanation, which generally treats the federal very separately or independent from the subfederal. I think I'll wrap it up here because I've spoken for 5 minutes. I think that's our time limit. But just to say that we think that there are other implications here for the ways in which commentators assume and think about immigration federalism. We think there are significant implications for the assumptions that courts make with regards to immigration federalism. As I said, both the majority and the dissent in the United States versus Arizona case assume, without empirical proof, that there is in fact these significant effects in Arizona or in these jurisdictions that are passing these types of laws. And overall, our project suggests that the limitations of that conventional explanation might suggest that the court should walk away or start to nudge itself away from structural power frameworks to understand immigration federalism, and perhaps use individual rights frameworks or other types of analytic methodologies to understand immigration legislation.
Thank you, Deep. Jessica.
Well, let me echo everyone's thanks. And also, say that I think I'm going to just expand out a little bit on Deep's comments. I don't have an empirical co-author, so I just have to go for the bigger claim, which is to say that I think in many important ways these days our states are serving as sites of national partisan conflict. That is, that our federalism is really partisan federalism. And so Deep has already begun to illustrate that claim for me. But let me say, I think it begins with the convergence of two trends that we've seen. One is the fact that the states and the federal government increasingly regulate in the same areas. They both operate in vast swaths of domestic policy, and so they are overlapping in jurisdiction rather than operating in separate spheres. At the same time, our two political parties have become increasingly ideologically cohesive and polarized, and so we have two parties that operate at the state and national levels that are polarized, governing in the same areas, but from different sites, from the state and from the national sites. And so we see these national conflicts playing out with the states as sites for staging and for amplifying the national partisan conflicts. So if you think of some of the recent federalism controversies we've seen, you can trace the partisan dimension. So think, for example, of the healthcare litigation. This is a pretty classic kind of federalism question, whether the federal government has overreached its authority, whether the federal government has encroached in so doing on state sovereignty. And so we saw states instantly after the act was passed lining up at the courthouse doors, but notably it was states with Republican governors and attorneys general, while states with Democratic governors and attorneys general responded by saying, no, the national government in fact does have this authority. And lest I suggest that this is simply a matter of Republican states, Republican actors siding with the states, while Democratic actors side with the federal government, which is another kind of classic federalism narrative. I don't think it's that simple. This year, if you look at the DOMA litigation alluded to by Steve, we see that quintessentially blue state, Massachusetts, coming out with the sovereignty argument saying that the Defense of Marriage Act intrudes on state sovereignty, while a group of Republican-governed states have come forward to say, no, the national government has the authority and the power to enact DOMA. So I think it's much more contingent than that. And as the comments have already begun to suggest, it's not just litigation and it's not just state sovereignty where these arguments play out. States, because they have the capacity to enact their own laws and to administer their own laws, often serve as sites for the enactment of laws that are not getting traction or not able to be passed at the federal level. So the voter ID laws are ones that are bandied about in Congress, not passed at the national level, and states enact them. That's sort of the Republican story. Maybe for a Democratic analog, you could think about certain environmental laws. We also see states engaging in what I've called uncooperative federalism, where they use the power that's granted to them by the federal government to administer federal law to actually push back against certain federal policy choices. Many of the reasons for why they push back and the ways in which they do so, I think, again, can be best explained by partisan politics. And immigration is an ongoing example of how the partisan politics at the national level also influence state dynamics and show us states pushing back against national policy choices through the administrative realm as well as the legislative and judicial realm. To my mind, the interpartisan conflict, the Democratic-Republican conflict, is really the primary axis that we see playing out. But I will note that it's not only interpartisan conflict, it's also intrapartisan conflict. And the fact that we have 50 states gives a little more scope, a little bit more of a playing field, if you will, for intrapartisan disputes to assume concrete form and to start to play out in a way that they can't here in Washington, D.C. So one example of this that is quite interesting that we're seeing right now, I think, has to do with the legalization of marijuana in Colorado and in Washington. If you look at polls, for instance, you might think this is a Democratic issue, at least for Democratic voters. But if you looked around Congress or the Obama administration, you wouldn't see marijuana legalization to be a Democratic issue. But these states, by legalizing marijuana under state law, are putting some pressure on the Democratic administration to take on an issue that it would rather dodge. I think I'll just note parenthetically that the interesting questions that are arising here are really practical and political ones about the federal government's choice with respect to enforcement of federal law. In some ways, we have the law and the policy in this area talking past each other in sort of oversimplified terms. I think we know that the state legalization of marijuana doesn't undo the federal prohibition, the federal criminalization, and the Controlled Substances Act. Likewise, to my mind at least, although I know courts have suggested some different lines of analysis here, the preemption arguments are not strong for the federal government to preempt state law. The fact that the states do not criminalize something the federal government independently criminalizes is not grounds for forcing the states to criminalize it. In fact, that would run afoul, I think, of the anti-commandeering prohibition. So the legal framework presents the states and the federal government as somewhat separate silos, but as a practical matter, the federal government relies on the states to carry out federal drug law. It's state officials who make, for example, 99% of the arrests. So if the states stop criminalizing marijuana and stop enforcing state prohibitions on marijuana, that has serious implications for the federal government's ability to carry out its policies. And so we see from the states acting from their space of legally separate sovereignty, a real overlap and integration with federal policy and a push to get the Democratic administration to take on an issue that it would rather avoid if it could. So in an effort to keep these remarks brief, maybe I'll just close with three thoughts about what partisan federalism might mean for our federal system. So one thought, which is probably obvious in what I've already said, is just that I don't think federalism has a consistently or necessarily conservative or liberal, Republican or Democratic bent. I think that's contingent. I think it's mutable. Second, and perhaps more important, when we're thinking about federalism questions, I think it's important to think beyond state actors versus national actors as occupying two separate camps, but instead to think about how a combination of state and national actors support federal power, and a different combination of state and federal actors support state power, and that changes, and it varies from instance to instance. And among other things, the fact that states have key roles in shadowing and in administering federal policy means that decisions states make along partisan as well as other lines have implications for the balance of power, the allocation of power within the federal government. So it's short-sighted in some sense to think about federalism and other structural systems like the separation of powers as distinct, and it's important to think about how they affect one another. And then finally, as Neil alluded to my conclusion here, I want to suggest that this kind of partisan federalism is still, in a sense, real federalism. In other words, that I'm not just describing here something that is no longer federalism. I think our federalism provides a constitutional structure for conflict. It provides a framework for staging forms of political and other competition and contestation. And so the fact that state and federal actors are motivated by something other than a defense of state power or national power as such does not, to my mind, diminish the fact that this is nonetheless federalism in action.
Well, thank you, Jessica. Have you ever listened to a panel and found it so generative that you had many things to say, but chances are you would get to say nothing or maybe just ask one question? Well, let me tell you what the beauty of being the moderator is. So what I thought I would do is just briefly try and characterize the different visions of federalism, right, that each of you have put on the table, ask some questions, and then invite you either to respond to them, to ignore me, and respond to one another, right, whatever moves you. So I think for Anita, as I understand her and as I read her work, right, federalism is, from a constitutional perspective, is first and foremost about the distribution and exercise of sovereign political power. And a big part of what she does is draw from constitutional text, structure, and history, and making arguments about the proper distribution of federal and state power, right? So from your point of view, Justice Scalia had it exactly backwards in Arizona intertribal, right? That the state should be calling the shot and the federal government should be designing its voter registration form according to the dictates of Arizona.
Bless his heart.
Yeah. I think you also put on the table that sometimes federalism is not about, right, big constitutional questions. It's about ordinary questions of statutory interpretation. That's a big part of what, right, courts do when they do federalism. And I think Arizona intertribal is very likely to turn on the difference between may and shall and what the statute actually means, not the constitutional question about the scope of federal power under the Elections Clause. Right, so you've got federalism is about power, federalism is about statutory interpretation, and these are, it seems to me, a conception from what I call the internal point of view. Right, how to best understand the Constitution and make claims on it. Steve is also operating from the internal point of view, and he's making the very interesting claim that federalism is about a lot of things we typically associate with federalism, but it's also about rights, right? It's also about liberty, and not in some vague, diffuse sense as a value of federalism, but in terms of the proper understanding of substantive due process. Liberty rights are important for their own sake, but he's also conceiving of judicially enforceable individual constitutional right as serving the structural purposes of the constitutional system. And then Deep and Jessica are operating more from the external perspective and trying, as Deep says, to describe, not necessarily to condemn, what's going on out there. And what they see going on out there is a lot of partisanship, right? Using the Constitution's structures in order to make partisan claims. If you're not in power in D.C., right, or if you are in power in D.C. and you disagree with what's going on within your own party, right? Federalism is very much about partisanship. Now, they're not exclusively operating from the external point of view. Part of Deep's implications are, right, they have some normative implications from the internal point of view, but it's federalism is partisan federalism. And so in terms of questions, I guess, Freenit, I'm wondering first, do you think there are more general lessons based on what you've said and also your work about the relationship between progressive scholarship and the authority of text, history, and structure? I think you're one of several progressive scholars who are saying or enacting the argument that it's not just for the right. It's not just for our friends on the right to make these kinds of claims. I also am wondering about when you hear Deep and Jessica talk about federalism as partisanship, well, voter registration, voter ID laws, right? What's your reaction to that? Does it change anything for you in terms of the kinds of claims you want to make? Steve, when you say it's a question of individual liberty, it's also a serious question of federalism. I still would like to hear more. What exactly is the federalism component of your argument? So those on the right who attacked the ACA were accused, including earlier today by Walter Dellinger, of making substantive due process arguments that were masquerading, right, as federalism arguments. Now, you're being quite transparent. You're relying explicitly on substantive due process. But I'm still wondering what exactly is the federalism component of the argument. Something that comes to my mind is the implications of what motivated the Constitutional Convention, and why do we have a robust Commerce Clause, and why do we have a dormant commerce principle? It's something about a national free trade zone. It's something about not having the distribution of labor and capital around the country being distorted by discrimination on the local level. So I'm not saying it's a dormant commerce argument that would work under current doctrine, but some of the values, the federalism values, as distinct from the human dignity values, seem to be what I associate with the reasons for a robust dormant commerce principle, even though textually the case for it is weak. Deep, I'm wondering a few things. I'm wondering if the politics of immigration may be changing, right, or whether you just predict failure in Congress based upon what you see going on in the incentives to defeat national legislation. And I'm also wondering that if you're right, that if so much of current federalism is partisan federalism, what should progressives do with that information, right? What should they do from the internal point of view? What should they do in making claims on the Constitution or in trying to change the law? What's the practical or the doctrinal implications? And then finally, Jessica, a few questions. So when did it start, right? Has our federalism always been partisan federalism, or is it a more recent phenomenon? Are you describing federalism better outside the courts than you are inside the courts? How do you explain the conservatives on the courts who, in responding to the ACA litigation, who must have been under enormous partisan pressure from their own friends, who said no? I'm talking about Larry Silberman. I'm talking about Jeff Sutton. Ultimately, when it mattered most, John Roberts, right? It must have been hard for them to reject the constitutional challenges, and Silberman and Sutton did it entirely, and Roberts did it to a significant extent. It seems like federalism for them is something more than just partisan federalism. So let me stop there and just invite each of you in turn to either respond to me or respond to one another.
Okay, so with respect to your first point about federalism not being just for the right, I think, and that's why I'm really thankful to be part of this panel, because it does give us an opportunity to show that federalism has different faces. I mean, particularly in the context of voting rights. Now, the interesting thing with my work is that I do think, given our constitutional structure, progressive scholarship in the voting rights area requires us to make concessions that we are not normally willing to make, right? You have to admit that states do retain some sovereignty over elections. If you want to be intellectually honest, if you want to be consistent with our constitutional text and structure, that is a concession you will have to make. A lot of people do not make it, right? They frame congressional authority as being plenary in this area. They frame congressional authority as being supreme in this area, right? Because we have a supremacy clause, yes and no, right? I mean, it's complicated. But I do think you have to start from a premise of understanding that the states were supposed to be sovereign in this area. Then you look at what happened with the 14th and 15th Amendments, and you go from there. So in many ways, it's hard for a progressive scholar who wants, who definitely have sort of preferred policy outcomes to start from that premise. But I do think in order to be intellectually honest, you have to start from that premise. Now, that being said, that doesn't necessarily dictate a conservative outcome. And that's what I realized over the course of my scholarship. It can be true that states retain sovereignty over elections, yet Congress is perfectly within its authority to renew the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. I found that those two things weren't necessarily inconsistent. And so to the extent that many progressives still think of federalism as a relic from, you know, sort of the states' rights arguments of the 1960s, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case anymore. You know, states at this point, in particular the gay rights debate, states really were the laboratories of democracy. You had some states that were passing gay marriage equality and other states voting against it, but they really were the laboratories of democracy and sort of the best example of how federalism is supposed to work. So to the extent that progressive scholars are still suspicious about federalism, I really do think that we should sort of shake that off and think about how federalism can work for progressive arguments. So that's the first thing. The second question makes me nervous. So the second question was my thoughts about partisan federalism, and in particular as it pertains to voter identification laws. And I'm okay with partisan federalism. Like, I love Jessica's work. But I wrote a piece called Partisan Gerrymandering as a Safeguard of Federalism. All of you would hate it. But I stand by it, right? So this piece looks at how partisan gerrymandering can actually promote federalism values, that partisan gerrymandering does not have to be a bad thing. So one thing that comes through in my work is I sort of take the world that we live in as the world we live in. Partisan gerrymandering is with us, and it will continue to be with us, even if you try to delegate it to independent commissions. What is an independent commission? That's made up. It's something that exists in our system. Now, our system does not have to be as dysfunctional as it is. I'm not saying that, but I sort of take the world that we live in and I go from there. And so from my perspective, there is some benefit to partisan federalism, right? And partisan gerrymandering is an aspect of that can help promote federalism values. Now, with respect to voter identification laws, I think one thing, voter identification laws are tough, right? Because it's often framed as a choice between sort of the specter of voter fraud, addressing a problem that doesn't exist, and voter identification laws. These laws actually have overwhelming support. And I think that as long as the state makes it easy for people to obtain the underlying documents, it is within their authority, their ability to choose the time, places, and manner of elections, their authority that they retain under the 10th Amendment to choose to enact the voter identification laws, independent of the partisan motivation behind the laws. Now, I should probably hide under the table after saying that, but I do think that states have this authority. And that's part of sort of reconciling my view of federalism with my progressive political agenda, right? I don't like voter identification laws. But that does not mean that I have to take the position that states are prohibited constitutionally from enacting them. I cannot do that and be intellectually honest. But there is a tension. But that being said, I challenge you guys to, especially those of you who are writing or thinking about federalism, to take on the mantle. You know, this doesn't have to be a conservative thing. It doesn't have to be a conservative argument. Now I'll stop there. I'm rambling.
Thank you very much.
Neil is certainly right that substantive due process, a liberty interest in the ongoing existence of your marriage, is the core of my argument. It's what I like to think of as the original contribution I've made in the article. But I think shining the spotlight on how states should be allowed to treat each other moderates the potential opposition to the use of substantive due process here. Anytime you use the Constitution to infringe the sovereignty of a state and constrain what a state can or can't do, it's controversial, and critics of substantive due process don't like it. I think adding the dimension of thinking about horizontal federalism here makes my substantive due process argument more reasonable and really quite limited. So right now, through the common law place of celebration rule, states already recognize, in the vast majority of cases, states already recognize each other's marriages. They do this as a matter of interstate comity. They do this because going back to the common law, the common law has recognized the necessity for the stability of legal relationships, that's more important than a state's own policy. We want to prevent the casual evasion of legal responsibilities by, allowing you to flee to a state that doesn't say you're married and you can avoid having to go through the divorce process. We want to encourage the free movement of people around the country. And so states have long bowed in their own sovereignty to the needs of the interstate system, which is another way of saying, I think, horizontal federalism, and realizing that generally it is better to validate marriages, to evaluate the legality of a marriage by the law of the place of celebration, rather than imposing the forum states, the new states' view in a way that would stamp out that marriage. So states have been doing this for a long, long time. Every state does this, except the mini-DOMA states carve out what I say is an unprincipled exception to this generally accepted, completely sound policy of interstate marriage recognition. Second, I think that thinking about this as a question of federalism helps illuminate the distinction I'm trying to draw between creating and recognizing marriages. If the Supreme Court were to give us the Loving versus Virginia for gay people, lots of people would say that's overreach, that's using the Constitution inappropriately to intrude on the prerogatives of the states. We should let the issue perk a while longer and so forth. Maybe, maybe not. But again, that's about creating marriages. I think there is a more sound argument for waiting and for the passive virtues there. Versus recognizing marriages, recognizing that when one state voids another state's marriage, it is intruding on essentially vested rights, expectation interests. It is trying to undo something that a sister state has done. So I think that as opposed to simply refusing to create something that hadn't existed previously. So I think just keeping federalism in the background of this also, again, helps us understand why there can be a sensible distinction drawn between creating marriages versus recognizing existing marriages for the purpose of the Constitution. And finally, I think this is an issue of federalism because when I talk about this question with many people, including many lawyers and law students, they immediately say, oh, the full faith and credit clause, right? This is just about the full faith and credit clause. Well, it's apparently, and the full faith and credit clause is one of the key federalism provisions in the Constitution, something that Justice Jackson says was intended to unite diverse and separate state legal systems into one national legal system. Well, the prevailing understanding among conflict of law scholars, at least, Supreme Court's never spoken to the question, is that the full faith and credit clause does not mandate the interstate recognition of same-sex marriages. That the Supreme Court has really eviscerated the meaning of the full faith and credit clause for statutory policies and really enforced it strongly only when it comes to judgments. Essentially, the conflict of laws scholars tell us a marriage is nothing more than a state licensing scheme, and a marriage license is essentially no more significant than my law license or a fishing license or a hunting license. Every state can force you to go through the requirements of getting one under its own laws and denying you one under its own laws if it wants to. I think that's a problem. I think marriage is a status and is different in important ways than my law license or a fishing license. But again, that's the prevailing understanding that the conflict of laws scholars have given us as to why the key federalism provision, a key federalism provision of the Constitution, the full faith and credit clause, is no help here. And so I sort of throw up my hands and say I think we have no recourse but to look to liberty and to think of this as a constitutional 14th Amendment question.
Thank you, Steve. Steve, did you want to respond? You want to respond either to me or to the other panelists?
I can respond to you, Neil.
Sure.
Because I like your questions because they give me the opportunity to play political scientist, which I'm happy to do. So you had your first question about the changing politics of immigration, and do we think that this is the system I described is sort of entrenched and can't be changed, and what prospects that has? That's how I interpreted your question. And certainly in light of the presidential election results from 2008 and 2012, you have significant concern from conservatives, losses and significant blame for those losses blamed on how votes on immigration or stances on immigration went in those two elections. One of the things that points out is how much immigration over the last, let's call it 10 years, 12 years, has become in many ways like abortion, which is sort of an odd thing, right? That if you look prior to 2001, most immigration legislation at the federal level was bipartisan. 1996 was bipartisan, but even before that, 1986 under President Reagan, and the immigration acts before that were all bipartisan efforts. But since 2001, with significant party polarization, you've actually gotten no bipartisan efforts on immigration. Usually when votes come up, you see people split, and you get very similar sorts of reactions as you do to other types of wedge issues. And so you see immigration emerging like that. But does the recent losses in 2012, does that change the calculus? And I think it might, but here's the thing. Even when you look at 2013, unless I think National Conservative Party folks can somehow ensure that local elections, local primary elections, are not going to be affected by challengers to incumbents who take more extreme immigration positions, something I don't think they can do. I'm not sure that at least in the next election cycle we're going to see significant change. These extra political constitutional actors that I'm talking about, interest groups that are highly focused on immigration, there's sort of two ways, I think, in which they operate. And one is sort of the external way in which we think that a lot of interest groups operate, that is through lobbying efforts. What's interesting about their lobbying efforts we found in our qualitative study is this, that at times they oppose federal legislation for things that we would understand. So if you're a restrictive or anti-immigration or anti-illegal immigration organization, it makes sense that when the DREAM Act was proposed as a standalone bill, even though it enjoyed significant support amongst the voting public, that they rallied intensely against it. That makes sense, right? It goes along with their sort of ideological perspective. What's more interesting, though, is May of last year, May 2012, there was a federal E-Verify bill being talked about in Congress. And so this would be a bill that makes, like Arizona's Legal Arizona Workers Act, a bill that forces businesses in Arizona to use the federal immigration database, E-Verify, to check employees' records, right, to make sure they're authorized workers. This would be the federal version of that. What's interesting is these same organizations oppose the federal bill. It seems odd because these were the organizations that were sponsoring the bills at the state and local level. So why would they do that, right? So I think part of that story is a commitment to wanting to have these measures enacted at the local level to create de facto policy through state and local legislation, because that you have the ability to legislate unmitigated or uncompromised forms of these particular types of things. So you have this sort of external lobbying. The other dynamic at work here is the internal dynamic, the endemic, the dynamic that's endemic to a federalist structure, and this is why national lawmakers have to take heed of the positions taken by local their local counterparts because they need that support when they're looking for re-election. That aspect of it obviously might be weakened as national party makers become more concerned about prospects for winning large national elections like the presidency over time. But I think still you'll see this dynamic still active in 2013, 2014. Your second question, what can progressives do or learn from this? And I think there's a couple thoughts here. One is that if our model is correct, a politicized explanation for what's happening, right? One thing that it might affect is certain, I guess, progressive theories of how to think about immigration federalism. So, for example, some scholars endorse what's known as a steam valve theory of immigration federalism. That is to say that it is actually better to allow jurisdictions like Arizona, Hazleton, et cetera, to we want them to enact these types of restrictive legislation because what it does is it releases the pressure then to enact this same legislation at the federal level, so you dissipate the momentum. That might be right underneath the conventional sort of idea of what's happening in a federalist framework. But if we're right, then the dynamic is actually the opposite. What you're doing with each sub-federal enactment is actually you're building momentum. You actually don't want federal legislation because that's going to dampen the ability to create this momentum horizontally across sub-federal jurisdictions. More broadly, though, I think what progressives can learn from the way in which this phenomena is created is that a legislative cascade has been effectively created by sub-federal immigration, especially restrictionist forces, and that's potentially could be mirrored on an integrationist or pro-immigrant or progressive agenda. There are certainly pro-immigrant sub-federal ideas, things like in-state tuition, municipal ID cards, welfare benefits legislation, and a whole host of things that driver's licenses is another thing that we might think of as ways in which progressives might get behind immigration regulation at the state and local level. But one thing that's clear from the example of the restrictive legislation is that you need a highly networked system in order to create this sort of cascade, and so that's something that can be gained. And then I think the final thing to think about here for progressives is a strategy of thinking, of trying to win in the judiciary, right, in courts and in judicial contests. I actually think that conservative forces, at least those that create these restrictive forms of state and local legislation, welcome. They're spoiling for a judicial fight. And I think even if you think of United States versus Arizona, there were several parts of SB 1070 that weren't even up for contest by the time the case got to the Supreme Court. They were not enjoined. At the Supreme Court, 3 out of the 4 provisions were enjoined, but 1 was left to go on. And if you think about Alabama has an immigration ordinance that has many of the same provisions as SB 1070, but it actually has several other provisions that are not covered by SB 1070. And so United States versus Arizona tells us very little about, for example, the education restrictions in Alabama's law or its restrictions on contracting by unauthorized immigrants. And so I think this process of using the judicial contest to reify ideas of structural power battles, to reify sort of the flawed factual claims that are being made as part of the proliferation of these laws is something that conservatives have done fairly well, and I think progressives can learn from that as well as a strategy. So, thank you.
Just quickly, I'll speak to the origins of partisan federalism and the inside-outside courts question. So, with respect to when partisan federalism started, I think what we're seeing now is very much a late 20th century, early 21st century phenomenon, especially insofar as there's sort of a federalism story packed into this with the Voting Rights Act and the rise of the Republican Party in the South, so that sort of the more liberal members of the formerly conservative Democratic Party stayed, while the more conservatives went to the Republican Party, and a similar transformation of the Republican Party in the North, so that we got parties that looked more cohesive throughout the nation, rather than having 4 or more regional-based parties, 2 parties throughout the nation, and that facilitates the use of states as sites of national partisan conflict. At the same time, I want to say there are deep roots to this phenomenon. So if you look back to some sort of key moments in American federalism. I think there are ways of telling partisan federalism stories about those moments. Just for one quick illustration, if you take the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions responding to the Alien and Sedition Acts, in many ways what you're seeing there is not a story about state versus national power as such. You're seeing a fight between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists about, yes, the reach of federal authority, but a reach of federal authority that is supported by one political party and opposed by the other political party. And then two national politicians, Madison and Jefferson, turned to the state legislatures to achieve the ends that they can't achieve at that moment in time at the national level, to sort of push back on the national government from the states, but in a way that is very much a story about partisan politics. So I think, again, what we see now has some distinctive qualities to this moment in time, but it has deep roots. And then I guess on the outside-inside courts question, I am telling primarily a story about outside the courts. I do think judicial actors, as a general matter, because of role morality and a sense of their jobs, are less likely to be opportunistic about these kinds of questions and to sort of take a sovereignty argument one day and turn it around the other day. At the same time, I do think if you step out at least one level of generality, perhaps you can see ways in which the doctrine could be described in similar terms. So I noticed that sort of the beginning of your remarks, Renita, when you talked about preemption and then federalism cases, and there's a sense, I think, in the judiciary that there are federalism cases and then there are preemption cases, and scholars, including some people I see in this room, have called our attention, of course, to the fact that, as you say, that preemption cases are federalism cases, and very much so. And so I think the sense in which some justices are more or less likely to recognize preemption has at least ideological, if not downright partisan, roots. As one of my students who I was teaching federalism cases to said to me this fall, do all the justices just go home and change their law clerks before they hear preemption cases? He just couldn't get his head around what happened when they were hearing sovereignty challenges versus sort of a preemption kind of case. But then, and then this will be my last point here, but just to maybe say that there are moments at least where we see even a departure from that level of generality. If you think about U.S. v. Arizona, the preemption tables turn and you suddenly see justices who tend to give the states more latitude, more room to maneuver, finding federal preemption, while the justices who tend to quash state experimentation are singing the praises of state experimentation and the limits of federal power. So I think there are times when even that narrative is too broad.
Okay, well, thank you. So before we open it up to questions from the audience, I'm wondering, time is short, if we can just cut to the chase. And I want to get your thoughts on this question. When it comes to federalism, what's in it for progressives? Right? Is it just something as a matter of intellectual honesty or consistency with the Constitution we've got to live with? There was no choice, but we had to have states, and we can't get rid of them now. And that whole thing about slavery and then post-slavery apartheid and all the states' rights arguments made about that. And Deep, you mentioned, right, pro-immigrant regulations and cascades can work in two directions. For Anita, if part of the goal is to try and get progressives, right, to think that federalism can help and not hurt, endorsing voter ID laws, right, so strenuously probably doesn't help the cause, but that's all right. That's your story. You're sticking to it. But general thoughts about that, right? Is federalism for the most part something progressives just need to live with, deal with, either as a matter of fidelity to the Constitution because they're faithful participants, or just as a strategic or political matter? Are there ways in which federalism affirmatively, right, advances progressive causes, right? So Steve, I think yours is an argument that in fact it's doing affirmative good from a progressive perspective, and not just something that's in the way and can be negotiated at least some of the time.
Okay, I'm going first on this one. I wouldn't say that was a full-throated endorsement of voter ID laws, but I think that your question raises an important point, though, right? What federalism is to the legal scholar does not have to be the same thing as federalism to the progressive advocate, right? So as a legal scholar, I can acknowledge that the states have authority to enact voter identification laws. But as a progressive advocate, I can go to state legislatures and advocate against them because it's not part of the progressive agenda. Just because a state can do something does not mean a state should do something. And so that being said, I don't write about voter identification laws because I don't like where it leads me. You know what I mean? But at the end of the day, I don't think that progressives should be afraid of federalism, and that you can actually go to the state level and advocate for policies that are favorable to progressives. That being said, legal scholars don't have to be afraid of it either, because there are some aspects of federalism that are beneficial to progressive ideals, even from a legal scholarship perspective. But with legal scholarship, you take the good with the bad, right? You have to, on one hand, acknowledge what states can do, even if you don't like it. But on the other hand, you can also use federalism to sort of promote those goals that you have in mind. As an advocate, you can be choosy, right? You can go to states and you can say, hey, this is a great policy, we should follow this. And you can advocate against those policies that you don't like. I just think legal scholarship, you are asking a different set of questions.
I guess I think Neil's question is another way of asking, is federalism a transsubstantive thing that progressives should embrace or reject? And I guess I tend to think it's morally neutral in the sense that it can be part of our toolbox, and there may be times when we can make federalism arguments that advance progressive causes, and times when we have to resist federalism arguments. That's different. I don't want to be understood to be saying we should be opportunistic or hypocritical. I mean, the same group of states and attorneys general who filed the brief that Jessica talked about saying, oh, no, there's no 10th Amendment problem with DOMA violating Massachusetts' right. We're the same group of attorneys general that turned around that filed a 10th Amendment challenge to the Affordable Care Act. So I'm not saying we should do that. I guess I'm just saying that I think we need to break out of this idea that federalism is, by definition, inherently something that serves progressive or conservative causes, and we can use the tools of lawyerly analogizing and distinguishing to use it to our advantage, hopefully in a principled way when it's necessary to do so.
So maybe I'll just be echoing the broad theme here, but certainly thinking about sort of partisan federalism and immigration federalism together, yeah, I mean, one of the stories I think to be told here is that perhaps progressives need to be more mercenary about the idea of federalism when it can be used. I think in immigration especially, there's opportunities. As I said, there are instances where you have states and localities enacting integrationist measures, right, and starting even in the 1980s from sanctuary ordinances that were enacted that continue on to today. But it's really interesting, right, because I think part of the problem that progressives are having is that their primary legal challenge to many of the restrictionist ordinances, like Arizona's SB 1070 or Hazelton's rental ordinances or any of the other ordinances, is based on either a federalism sort of dormant immigration power or constitutional preemption argument, or on a preemption supremacy argument that federal law simply forbids it, right? So a lot of weight being put on the structural power framework as the way in which to litigate and get rid of these sub-federal enactments. Doing that obviously then creates, perhaps an inconsistency when those same pro-immigrant or advocacy groups turn around and support the efforts of, let's say, Chicago and its resistance of the Federal Secure Communities Program, or support California's decision to allow in-state tuition to undocumented students who are in California, right? And so there's clearly that inconsistency that arises. Now, one could make, and I think, reasonable distinctions there to separate the sort of the integrationist types of sub-federal laws from the restrictionist types of laws, but it gets hairy, right? And it doesn't look good, I guess, from the outside to be making those two types of arguments together. But I think perhaps even more problematic, I would argue, for the progressive agenda here, is that continued reliance on a structural power framework to think about problems of immigration federalism, is that it obscures other avenues that might be explored. And I think specifically with regards to immigration, I don't know how well this translates into other areas, maybe into voter ID, but the relationship between immigration and racial threat is undeniable, right? There's a strong connection here, and I think that what progressives need to do, maybe not the legal scholars, but certainly political scientists, sociologists, et cetera, is we need to push more on emerging empirical evidence with regards to the proposal and motivations for creating these sorts of laws in the first place, right? And so that we can have a more robust individual rights or equality framework within which to understand sub-federal immigration regulations or immigration regulations either at the federal level or at the sub-federal level, rather than continuing to rely on these ideas of structural power and the fact, sort of relying on this idea that as long as the federal government's doing something, then we're okay, right, as far as a progressive or integrationist agenda, which I don't think is actually true.
So I think, Deep, you raise a very important question, which is how do we know when we're dealing with a federalism problem, a problem of the structure? How do we know when we're dealing with an equality or a liberty problem? How do we know when we're dealing with both? I mean, we may be days away from a Supreme Court decision striking down Section 3 of DOMA, and it may be necessary to the judgment to have one or more justices restricting the scope of the necessary and proper clause. That the real problem with DOMA is a federalism problem. It's not an equality problem. And a question progressives should ask themselves is, do you want to win in that way? It seems like you'd rather win than lose. At the same time, you've already had restrictions on the necessary and proper clause, at least ostensibly imposed in the Affordable Care Act decision. Do you want more? It's a pretty, in my view, narrow view of the necessary and proper clause that are emanating from conservative quarters. And so I think progressives, while there may be reasons of principle not to act inconsistently, there also may be good pragmatic concerns about when you're playing with limits, you're playing with fire, right? And your constitutional theories reflects your hopes and your fears. And you may win today by having a court endorse limits that you're proposing, but will it end up hurting you more the next time around? If DOMA goes because of states' rights arguments, is the court in the same breath supposed to turn around and say, and California can't ban same-sex marriage because states' rights arguments don't matter and this is an equality problem? Not so sure. It's always better to win on any ground possible. So let's open it up to all of you. We have about 15 to 18 minutes for questions. Yes. Oh yes, I should. I've been asked to let me first read the instructions. I've been instructed to remind you to wait for the microphone and to ask questions that are both short and actual questions. Now, I was accused of violating this rule in an earlier session, so I may be stopped from enforcing it now. But there you have it. All right.
So, sort of contra New York v. United States, which suggests that if you let voters know which sovereign is governing, then they'll be able to make intelligent decisions in election. What the political science research shows is that the primary driver of voter decisions is the state of the economy in the election. And that leads to a situation like what we're probably looking at in Ohio right now, where President Obama, in a state whose economy was doing pretty good, campaigned for re-election and say, oh, it was my auto bailout that did that for you. And then and people believe him and he wins the state. And then a year later, John Kasich's going to turn around and the polls show this is probably going to work for him and say, no, actually it was my conservative policies that led to this economy that you like so much. And the voters are probably going to believe him. So the question I have is it possible to build a federalism that allows the voters to be educated about which policies are actually working, which policies aren't working, that actually rewards politicians who do good work in improving the economy instead of just freeloading off the other guy who's doing it? Or is it implicit in the notion of dual sovereignty that there's going to be confusion about who is achieving the thing that people are voting for?
I mean, it's a great and, as you acknowledge, very hard question. I think in some sense, I mean, maybe paradoxically, in some ways, the better way of achieving some kind of accountability, although it's not the robust kind of all the way down accountability you're suggesting, is to have more alignment between the state and the national politicians. I think the same kinds of studies you're referring to suggest that voters tend to blame either the president or the governor for economic conditions, but depending on partisanship, so depending on actually which party they belong to, which party they affiliate with, and which the governor and the president respectively belong to, such that if you have a sort of partisan politics that is consistent at the state and the federal level, the fact that state voters are voting based on national partisan preferences, which is often cited actually as a sort of fundamental problem for our federal system insofar as we don't see people robustly affiliating with the states and having a sense of state identity that's distinct from their national identity or sense of politics. It suggests that you could get some more accountability that way, but of course, as I suggested at the beginning, it's a thin kind of response insofar as what the particular politicians are doing is not necessarily picked up by that. It's a more aggregate account, but at least I think, to my mind, probably the better means, and this is why I think some of the language in cases like New York and Prince, where the court waxes eloquent about accountability, really falls short in terms of describing what voters actually understand or what motivates them or what they act on. So in some sense, having more overlap and more, if not redundancy, at least consistency across the levels seems to me a better way to achieve some sort of accountability.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, if you think accountability is a core constitutional value in the area of federalism, right, how do you explain Articles 1, 2, and 3? I mean, how do you explain a robust separation of power system at the national level? And then how do you explain having a robust vertical separation between the federal government and the states with overlapping legislative jurisdiction? It seems like there are other values that are much more important than accountability. If you wanted accountability, you would want consistency within the federal government as well as between the federal government and the states, and you don't get that. And in terms of judicial enforceability, I mean, think about what the court is saying in New York and Prince about how accountability is compromised by commandeering, because it's so hard to tell people who's responsible for the regulation, because it's so hard if people pay attention. If they don't pay attention, are they really within help from the judiciary? And preemption doesn't compromise accountability, and conditional spending doesn't. And think about it in the Affordable Care Act litigation, right? Where you can't call it a penalty and then uphold it as a tax. That would compromise accountability. I mean, have you taken a look at the tax code? I mean, how much spending is buried in the tax code? How many domestic expenditures are characterized as military expenditures? Right? Do the courts enforce that? Right? So I mean, I see a lot of this coming up in the context of litigation to achieve certain objectives, but it doesn't seem really to describe well the constitutional system we have. Yes. I'm sorry, I don't know you. Okay.
My name's Cameron Kuhlman. I wonder if, for Professor Buhlman-Posen, if you accept this overlapping areas then as sites of contest, that sort of requires a winner. And then so it's not so much now respect for state sovereignty as much as it is like God bless the several state superiority. And so I wonder if we can move away from that by having less overlapping areas. Do we have to have a winner, or does it have to be all these sites of contest, or could we have more discrete sort of allocation of authority in some federalist model?
So in other words, would in some sense a true system of dual sovereignty or separate spheres for state and federal action be a preferable?
Correct. Would less contest between federal and state action for, you know, who's going to be the winner of this particular policy or position help us move in a more progressive direction?
So I guess I'm inclined to say no. I mean, it seems to me that the ways these contests play out doesn't necessarily yield a winner. I mean, that's in some ways that's part of the function of having 50 states, regardless of whether they're independently sovereign and somehow seen as final decision makers, or more in the service of constitutive units of the nation. So the sheer fact of 50 and of sort of potential iterations and multiple sites of contestation. It might be that on some issues, if you have discrete state and national power where the states are the final arbiters, you get decisions you like better in some states and not in others. But I'm not sure that at the end of the day that looks all that different from a system of overlap, again, given the many different ways in which the states and the national government overlap. It seems to me, maybe coming back to some of the earlier themes, that one limitation of thinking about federalism, because it has tended to be a more conservative notion that we should embrace federalism rather than a progressive notion, is to focus on questions of sovereignty and on questions of a discrete state power to stop national action, rather than on focusing on ways that states, in fact, can affirmatively act, even if the national government is also acting, and even if the national government can, in fact, trump the states in any given instance. And again, there are other scholars who have called attention to this, but it seems that one main current of a progressive federalism scholarship might be to move the discussion actually away from sovereignty and towards ways that states are acting affirmatively and acting to sort of take measures even in times when they are not going to be the final decision maker.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Jerry Evans. I'm in private practice in Charleston, South Carolina. I wanted to ask if you could address a little more Section 2 of DOMA and its impact, assuming Section 3 goes away, and particularly your hypothetical couple in Indiana. How is the federal government going to view their marriage, and might this lead to fairly chaotic and absurd results? And I can say, as someone in deep red South Carolina, the ensuing chaos is probably my fastest path toward marriage equality.
Well, yeah, as a formal matter, I think many, if not most, conflict scholars and full faith and credit clause scholars think that Section 2 of DOMA was basically superfluous. So Section 2 basically says that no state shall be required to recognize any other state's marriage if it doesn't want to, and that purports to be an application of the full faith and credit clause. Congress is given the power to define the meaning and application of full faith and credit in the full faith and credit clause. I think most people think states had that power inherently anyway under the public policy exception to the general rule of interstate marriage recognition. So it's debatable whether Section 2 adds anything to sovereign power that states had anyway to refuse to recognize each other's marriages. But yeah, I think the New York Times story today nicely highlights that there's a huge looming question out there if Section 3 falls. That doesn't necessarily mean that couples in Indiana or South Carolina or other mini DOMA states are going to be able to access federal benefits, because the next question will be, it presents a choice of law question for the federal government. Does the federal government follow the law of the state where the couple resides, which says they are not married, or does it follow the law of the state that performed the marriage in the first instance, the place of celebration rule? The New York Times talks about this today. The only scholar that I'm aware has explored this issue in depth is Will Bode, who had an article in the Stanford Law Review about a year ago parsing through this issue, and he basically takes the stance that the sensible thing would be for Congress to pass a statute saying that the federal government should follow the rule of the state where the couple was married, that the marriage, once valid, should remain valid. He says if judges end up deciding the question, they should be more modest and say that it should be controlled by the law of the state where the couple resides. But yeah, I think that story today was interesting because it's maybe the first commentary I've seen in the popular media that says, not so fast, just because DOMA goes away, we're still going to have this thorny question of whether the federal government should consider you to be married or not.
Fred? Let's just wait for the microphone.
Gonna be breaking rules. My name is Fred Smith, assistant professor at Berkeley Law School. For Nita, my question is around the Republican form of government clause that Pam invited us to think about today. So Article 4, Section 4. So it says, United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a Republican form of government. What does that mean for states' ability to protect their own electoral procedures? Or does it instead suggest that maybe Congress does have a fair amount of power in that area? And then quickly, a question for you, Steve, is just a normative question. What's to prevent someone from my home state of Georgia who lives there, right? So if you lived in Atlanta, from just going to New York, getting married, and then going back home? So those are the questions.
The guarantee clause is a tough one, though, in part because now there is some scholarship suggesting that Congress does have authority under the guarantee clause to deal with some of these issues surrounding voting rights. And there's actually some precedent to support that. So in 1867, Congress passed the Military Reconstruction Act. And what it did was it basically put the South into federal receivership. kind of similar to the Voting Rights Act now. But one thing that it does that's notable, that it did that was notable at the time, was the fact that it forced the southern states to call new constitutional conventions, and it also forced them to choose delegates to those conventions through universal suffrage. So basically, the former slaves were allowed to vote for these delegates who would then go to the state capitals to draw new constitutions. And so Congress did this pursuant to its authority under the Guarantee Clause. It wasn't a 14th Amendment yet. And so the interesting thing now, I guess, will be, can Congress do something similar now? You know, can Congress use the Guarantee Clause as a source of authority to, for example, justify Section 5? I think Pam Carlin would say, sure, you know. And also, Jack Chan is another who has written on the vitality of the Guarantee Clause. Me, I'm not so sure. There are also scholars who have written about how the Military Reconstruction Act is probably unconstitutional, rather than conceding that the Guarantee Clause is a source of authority for congressional action in this area. But another reason it's hard to tell is because, as you've written on this, is the Guarantee Clause is non-justiciable. So it's not clear that there's any definitive answer to this. Yeah. Well, just in terms of having a clear answer about whether or not Congress can legitimately enact legislation pursuant to the Guarantee Clause. It's not, since the court has basically said it's non-justiciable, it's not like we would really have an answer to that question. Now, could Congress just do it and we see what happens? Sure. Like, I would be okay with that. And then the court could then say, okay, this is a non-justiciable political question, or the court could do a Baker versus Carr and say, this isn't even a Guarantee Clause issue. This is an equal protection issue, and then go from there. So I do think it matters that the fact that the clause is non-justiciable, and that's probably why Congress hasn't relied on it now, even though you do have what I think is good precedent showing that the clause could do some work in this area. So that's a long way of saying I'm not sure.
Well, if you want to make the clause justiciable, right, start having Congress use it in the ways that you're imagining. Steve?
I explained in the piece, so I would not apply my rule, my due process right, to what are known as evasive marriages, the things you're describing. I live in Indiana, I fly to Boston or New York for the weekend with my boyfriend to get married and expect Indiana to recognize it. All I want to do is use the Constitution to prevent states from carving out a gay and lesbian exception to an established rule of comity, of interstate recognition, the place of celebration rule. Conflict of laws has always looked with disfavor on evasive marriages and has drawn a distinction between people who get married in a state, are bona fide residents there, good faith, get married, move to another state, versus people who are seeking to just evade their own state's marriage laws and have given those laws less status, less presumptive right to recognition. I think that when you do that, that is essentially you're just engaging in an act of civil disobedience. You're making a statement about the injustice of your own state's marriage law, as opposed to, I think, when you get married in a marriage equality state and then move to a mini-DOMA state, you have acquired what is essentially a vested right. You can call it a reliance interest or an expectation interest that the state should not be allowed to take away from you. You just don't acquire that kind of reliance or expectation interest reasonably as a normative matter when you simply seek to flout your own state's marriage law.
Well, thank you, Steve. We are almost at the end of our time together, and I want you to join me soon in thanking our panelists. But before I do that, I have some announcements to make. The silent auction taking place on the Capitol Terrace and Upper Lobby begins immediately following this session. There's also an informal breakout session, ALICE, Progressive Response to ALEC, in the California room. At 6 o'clock, we invite you to join us in the presidential ballroom for a discussion entitled A View from the Bench, featuring current federal district and circuit court judges. And the day will conclude with a reception in the congressional and Senate rooms at 7 p.m. Volunteers will be on site to help direct you to these locations. Thank you all for joining us today, and please join me in thanking our most thoughtful and engaging panelists.